Hello, everybody. I am Marc LiVecche. I am the executive editor of Providence Magazine and the incoming Stockdale Fellow with the U.S. Naval Academy. And I am here with my friend and colleague, Daniel Strand, and together we form a new episode or a new webinar series called True North. And this is episode 2 of True North. Is it not, Daniel?
It is.
Indeed.
Episode 2. Here we go. One
All
down.
right. Who are you and what are we talking about?
Well, we figured we had so much fun last time and we got lots of great responses. And it seems like the conversation about World War II, the bombing, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki just keeps on going. So we figure why stop?
Right. Did we lose any friendships? Have we lost any friendships?
I don't know. I'm not sure yet.
I don't think so.
We'll find out.
But maybe.
Yes. When COVID's over and people start having parties again, I'll find out which parties I'm not going to. So
nicely. That's a good way to do it. That's a good way to do it.
Yeah.
All right.
So I figured today what we could start off with doing is get some of your reflections and my reflections after you published another piece in the Federalist, which I encourage everybody go and read. It's a fantastic piece. Mark did an excellent job of laying out a really thorough historical and moral case, which I think was well received. I'm sure some people did not like it.
A few did not like it.
You did not like it.
I've been called some names.
Yes. But it's been interesting to me, Mark, to find some other pieces. Rebecca Heinrichs, one of our own contributing editors, wrote a nice piece on Nagasaki. And then I also found some other pieces by historians, Christian historians. One, Philip Jenkins, which I encourage people. He's a professor of history at Baylor University. Wrote a piece eerily similar to what we've been saying, which is he concluded his piece with basically saying, what else were we supposed to do?
Right.
What else were we supposed to do? And I think that was, at least you find a lot of historians making that case. What we don't find are people, moralists like us, who are willing to go there. So you can either touch on that or just add your own reflections and have at it.
Yeah, very good. First of all, if anybody saw what just happened, right down here, I changed the name. It used to say Mark Melton. I will not impugn to him any of my own thoughts. So I've changed the name. The name has been fixed. I am, as I've said, Marc LiVecche. Yeah, Daniel, as you know, and as you said in episode 1, introducing our discussion of this last week, I've spent the last large chunk of time actually thinking about Hiroshima. Because I am sort of naturally drawn to sort of intractable moral dilemmas. I find them invigorating. It's partly why I became an ethicist. I broached the subject of my writing a book on Hiroshima to a very well-known ethicist who has done a lot of his own fantastic work. And one of his initial responses was sort of a curmudgeonly, "Oh, that's been done." Right, referring to Miss Campbell and Winters and all the good books that are already out there. Instinctively, I believe that not everything had been said. And so one of my first reactions to both our interview, the Federalist piece, and our just getting, or really just the events surrounding the 75th anniversary, is a confirmation of my instinctive belief that actually not everything has been said. And if it has been said, not everybody has heard it. And so it ought to be said again, and hopefully by contributing something new. And I think what we are contributing that is new is a moral defense of the bombing. People have said, look, it was the right thing to do, by which they usually mean some sort of version of it was the necessary thing to do militarily or to prevent a greater amount of moral evil. And so it was a lesser evil, very dirty hands argument that we have cast as a Niebuhrian sort of paradox between, doing what is loving and doing what is responsible. And you can't do both. Right. So I think we are contributing something new. We're taking a line that says this was not simply a lesser moral evil. It It was the greatest possible moral good. It was the morally right thing to do. And importantly, to not have done it would have been a morally wrong thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
So the instinct that I've not been wasting my time rehashing an old argument has been confirmed. And, for better or for worse, that's a good thing. One of the things that has come to the fore for me personally is a recognition that what's really at stake, Hiroshima in some sense, is really just a case study. You and I have identified, and some of our interlocutors have identified, that what's really at stake is how do we think about moral rules.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's obviously a perennial issue of continual importance.
Mm-hmm.
You say, and I have said that, one of the things we keep coming back to is to ask those who disagree with us, what would you have done? What alternative would you have done? And one of the responses, and it's not a bad response in and of itself, is to push back and say, the reason that you are suggesting we should have dropped that bomb on that city is a certain reading of the facts. And people will push back and say, but of course, facts don't interpret themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been one of the major pushes that I've had. And so I want to make a clarification that I've made in the past, but I want to make again. My argument that we should have dropped the bomb is, of course, based on a certain reading of the historic facts. Of course it is. And that's partially our point.
Yeah.
The Japanese were not close to surrender. That's one of my facts. All the alternatives were far more morally reprehensible. That's one of my facts. If you wanted to save the innocent, you dropped that bomb. That's one of my facts. On and on and on. I have a whole set of facts that we've laid out in various ways and will continue to lay out, that if you change any of them significantly enough, if we discover, in fact, that the Japanese were about to surrender, then guess what? We don't drop that bomb, right? And so one of the important things to remember ought to be obvious. If you change the facts, you change the prescribed action, and that's crucial. So facts don't interpret themselves. Of course they don't. They never have. So somebody has to. Mm-hmm. And the responsible Christian does the best they can with the available information, recognizing partial knowledge, recognizing that we don't have omniscience, dreading that we might be wrong, and yet we move responsibly forward. Now, the absolutist will look at that same set of limitations and they will say, therefore, we rely on moral rules that are absolute because we might be wrong and there is far too much at stake. And so we don't cavalierly interpret the facts and sort of adjust our moral rules based on how we read them. My response to that, and this needs to be developed, is that we are called to be that we are moral ethicists. We're not moral accountants. We're not moral bureaucrats. Morality is not simply a checklist of things you just sort of tick off and out comes your moral action. It's not like that. Morality is supple without being subjective. It's flexible without being without foundations. So much of morality begins with a question that's something like, is sex wrong? Mm-hmm. Well, you shouldn't be able to answer that question without more information, right? And once you get more information, you begin to qualify it.
Right. Are you married?
Are you married, right? Are we talking about rape? Is rape wrong? Oh, that's highly qualified sort of, I hardly want to call that a sexual activity. It's something far more abhorrent. But, if you qualify it and say rape, it is always wrong, period. You never do it. That's it. Right? Is killing wrong? I don't know. What kind of killing? Oh, murder. Yes, murder is always wrong. You never do that. Right? But, so that's one reaction to all of this. Circumstances matter, consequences matter.
Yeah. I mean, so two things strike me, and then I want to ask you another question. One thing strikes me is, well, I mean, it's not surprising if you go to Twitter or you go on social media of any sort, or you go on to the, whatever journal sites and people kind of yelling at each other back and forth. You just get reaction. And I think at least one of my conclusions, not just based from social media, but just in general, and this is I mean, this is a point that's not new to me. It's something that just over time, I think, and just the character of the age that we live in, is that we live in such a reactionary age. And that's not an amazing insight at all, but it comes across in debates like these in this way, which is an ethicist is not someone who comes to a problem that's been debated for 75 years with simplistic moral judgments.
Hmm.
I mean, and that's where I feel like where I've seen some ethicists say this is just out of bounds and this is just obviously wrong. I want to push back and say, right, I mean, ethicists shouldn't be engaging in sort of perverse speculation, and maybe to them that's what this is, but at least at a bare minimum, what an ethicist should look at is say there is a genuine debate that's been going on for 75 years. And
Right.
it's a genuine debate. It's not obvious. If you just want to count, say, heads,
Hmm.
you have a pretty even split amongst academics. They're going to be more opposed than for, but there's a genuine divide. At the time, it was supported heavily. So it's at least a conflict. It seems to me that, I mean, I'm glad we're having this conversation and that it's getting some headway in public, because it just feels like it too easily slips into the reactionary mode where we're not actually thinking. The thinking stops,
Right.
which is the frustrating part, because you think, especially for intellectuals, academics, people who want to debate this thing, I mean, when I read the kind of critiques of it and the pushback that you received or I received in defense of it, so much of it does seem to be of that quality. It's just a sort of um, moral judgment or pathos or whatever that cuts off kind of real nuanced consideration just by saying, I no, I won't go there. I don't want to even countenance the thought of it. Which leads me to my question to you. Sorry for that long comment, but has anybody yet given you an option of what else they might do besides the bomb? I mean, and
No.
that's what I do to people. I keep on saying, please give me a policy. Give me, you are Truman. What do you do?
Right. Uh, so two answers. The first answer and the abiding answer ultimately is no. People have not. And in fact, in an exchange between Miss Campbell and I believe Tollefson, I know Tollefson in public
Mm,
discourse,
yeah.
Tollefson at one point um, denies the responsibility, denies the duty. I believe he puts it. He denies the duty to offer an alternative, which has a certain logic to it. You come up against what you ought to do, and this is what you ought to do. You know, I'm not
Right.
going to give you an alternative. This is what you do. I get
Right.
that, and in its own internal logic.
Yeah.
Uh, but the answer is no. Now, the qualification to the answer is that some people will insist on what I take to be, and my betters, my historic betters, take to be bad history. They will say, well, you know, if we would have just guaranteed the sanctity of the emperor, which in our last episode we actually first, you know, pushed back and said, why on God's green earth would we have guaranteed out of hand
Hmm.
the sanctuary of the emperor? But regardless,
Yeah.
they act as if, well, the history is clear. If we would have just guaranteed the safety of the emperor, the Japanese would have stood down.
Mm,
And so they get out of it by saying, well, you know, we just wanted to fire the first shot of the Cold War, or, you know, we're racists, or
hmm.
whatever. So the answer is no, they have not.
Okay.
And I don't know, is that, you know, is that something more than, you know, what is that? I guess that's my question to you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is there
I,
a motive behind that? Is that a kind of, is that a strategy? Or do they just not know, but they think they don't need to know? Because look, you know, we are only responsible for what we do. We cannot be responsible for what we don't do. I guess the poor schmuck who has to do those other alternatives is responsible, but that's not my business. I've never understood that.
yeah.
But, you know, we're responsible for the evil that is certain. We're not responsible for the evil that might come of other things.
Yeah.
Uh, I, I don't
My
know what
response to, I mean, I guess, yeah, I don't know if you're right. I'm not sure. I share the same confusion because I feel like to me that um, you're waging war. Your end state is the defeat of a wickedly evil um, regime that is causing death and mayhem
Right.
to the tune of about 250,000. This is outside of the U.S. and the Japanese conflict itself.
Right.
Best estimates 250,000 a month are dying.
Civilians in occupied lands.
Civilians. So
Yeah.
this is we're talking the Philippines, which the war continued, China, Burma, other islands around the Pacific where the brutalities continued, and those were Japanese occupied lands. The Russians don't come in until the final weeks of the
Right.
war. So,
There was a telling exchange that I saw probably years back, probably in response to a post I did for Providence on Hiroshima. And somebody pushed back, and eventually Nigel Bigger got drawn into it somehow. And Nigel asked a question that I've heard him ask before, which I think is a great question because it reveals a lot. And his question to this guy was, there was a historic case, I think it's a real case, in which a French village had been liberated from the Nazis by the British. The Nazis were pushed out, the German soldiers at least, if they weren't a Nazi corps, I don't know. A British officer is speaking to a newly liberated French family. They're, of course, grateful, and they're talking. It's a mother and a father and their children. And all of a sudden, an artillery shell lands in the midst of them. A German counteroffensive has just begun to retake the village. The British officer is knocked unconscious. He wakes up fairly quickly. The entire French family is dead, except for the little boy. Half of him is gone. His entrails are on the ground. He's obviously going to die. There is no other possible outcome for him. But he's screaming in agony and terror. And the Germans are beginning to pour back into the village. The British troops retreat. And now the British officer has a choice to make. What does he do? And he decides to pull out his sidearm, and he kills the boy. As an act of mercy, because the boy is going to die and he's in agony, and he runs off. Nigel asks our interlocutor, how do you interpret this? And the man responds by saying, I interpret that exactly as I would interpret any case of euthanasia. Right. And Nigel says, well, yes, but where was the evil? Where was the moral evil located? I shared this anecdote with somebody else, another good friend of ours who's recently been pushing back against us. And I gave him that scenario, and he said, but Mark, that's not the only alternative. Shoot the boy or run away. And I said, well, what would you have done? And in this particular instance, he does provide the alternative. He says, I hope I would have sat on the ground and put the boy's head in my lap and helped him, just kept him company until he died. Which means I would have been taken prisoner by the Germans, which means I would have abdicated my responsibility as an officer in the British Army to continue a fight against a fascist regime that needs to be defeated, which means leaving my troops without an officer, on and on and on and on. And there's a beauty to that response, but there's also a frustration in that, that does that really cohere with Christian responsibility in a world in conflict? Like, really, is that the thing to do? And I think one of the things that's revealed, and we've talked about this before, is that no matter what you choose to do in that situation, your choice is tragic.
Yeah.
Right? But what do you do
So
in
what
the
do we
real
do
world?
with that? We're talking about an event that happened 75 years ago.
Right.
A lot of people will say World War II is this unique time. Two uniquely evil political entities, leaders waging war. So that's an easy, the World War II exception case, right? The good war.
Right.
But what about today? Do we still have tragedies like this going on today? And does this sort of thinking that you and I have been batting around, does it still apply today? What would you say to the person curious on that front?
Sure. I mean, of course, the battlefield death scenarios that Nigel Bigger has done a lot of work on will continue, unfortunately, to apply.
Yeah.
There's always going to be those kinds of horrific occasions in which a battlefield mercy killing seems to be it seems to be a moral possibility, at least a question.
Yeah.
But even the people who disagree with us will look at such moral tragedies as an ectopic pregnancy, for instance. That's a famous example in which you have, a situation in which the baby is never going to develop. The baby is going to die. There is no
They're in the
um,
fallopian tubes, if I'm correct, right? It's a
right.
baby that, yeah,
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 exactly.
birth
Baby,
plant. Yep.
attaches to the fallopian tubes.
Right.
Now, there's no scenario in which the baby is going to live. Now, the
Right.
only question is whether or not the mother is going to live or to die with the child. And
Mhm.
so, under these circumstances, under the rule of double effect, you can cut out the fallopian tubes indirectly, killing the child. Your aim is the welfare of the mother. Your aim is to remove the fallopian tubes, but with a
Right.
certainty that the
Right.
baby will die, and that's a
Evil will die.
recognized tragedy. But it's considered moral under double effect. Hiroshima, a lot of people will say, well, that's not covered under double effect. So those are simply different things. I'll grant that there are different scenarios or different circumstances. But
Yeah.
what I think is important
Yeah.
is that a toehold has been made that acknowledges the possibility of moral tragedy. And that's at least an important place of common agreement to start with.
Yeah.
That the moral life is perilous. Even Stanley Hauerwas will say that pacifism carries its own
Yeah.
allowance for tragedy, because if the pacifist does what they believe to be correct, it might mean watching the innocent be marched away into the woods, which in fact it often does mean that.
Right.
And he recognizes there's a tragedy. So I think the other important thing to point out in all of this is that it's not just you and I and those who agree with us that act as if, it's our moral life that is tragic. We're the Jack Bauers of the world who take these, horrible burdens for the sake of trying to do what's right. Even those who stand down and don't do what they believe to be a morally corrupt action
Yeah.
uh, are accepting a dimension of tragedy.
Yeah. It seems like the idea of sin of omission is often, we're talking about sins of commission here. We're talking
Right.
about things that we do wrong, but there is Paul Ramsey famously likes to use the parable of the Good Samaritan
Yeah.
as the paradigm for a just warrior. That in what the parable teaches is essentially the sin of commission. People who go by after an evil has been done, at least in that case. And Ramsey wants to apply that globally. He wants to say that the lesson, the norm that's being taught here is um, that if not only do we help people and bandage them up after tragedies happened, if we can go upstream and find where the robbers are
Mm-hmm.
and arrest them and stop them from doing wreaking havoc on the next Samaritan that crosses, or the next traveler on the road, then
Sure.
we ought to do that. Um, any other conclusions, thoughts you wanna add as we wrap up here?
One, just a framework maybe for thinking about this, and this is going to sound uncharitable, so it might not be true, or in fact, those that I suggest this to be true of might say, well, no, that is true. That's exactly the point. My
Hmm.
paradigm is this: it seems that there's always going to be several ways of thinking about moral questions. And I have realized, and I owe a lot of sort of this thinking to, like to having lived my life with my wife and some of the things that we've continually been talking about. And that's that the approach that I take toward moral rules, and the approach that as an atheist or as an agnostic or whatever it is that I was before I was a committed Christian, the approach I took even then, and what I found attractive about what I thought was the common assumptions about Christianity, is that Hebraic thought matters in history. It takes history seriously. It believes that Hebraic moral action uh, can improve the historic situation. It doesn't believe that we can eradicate evil, but it does believe absolutely that we can eradicate some evils.
Right.
Um, we can do that. We can have consequential action in history, and it matters in part because
Yeah.
matter matters, right? History
Yeah.
matters. Our God is a God of history. He's
Yep.
active in history. So ought the people who love him and follow him. So when I approach morality, a question that I'm always trying to ask is, how do I move this present situation closer toward shalom,
Hmm.
closer toward the way things ought to be, comprehensive welfare extending in every direction? How do I move this situation closer to that? And I tend to take my moral bearings from whatever answer, to the best of my ability, acknowledging my lack of omniscience, infallibility, and all of that, and ability to self-deceive, acknowledging all of that. I take my moral bearings by the answer that I come up with about how I can move the situation humbly, and approximately more toward shalom. I have a feeling other people ask the question, what is the right thing for me to do in this moment in order to be pious and holy and to keep my hands and therefore my soul unstained,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Uh, is it a concern about shalom versus salvation?
Yeah.
Um, I believe God loves me and God will judge my intentions.
Hmm.
Um, Intentions matter. Somebody recently told us that they don't care what Truman's intentions were. God
Yep.
cares what Truman's intentions were. He doesn't. Well, I do care about Truman's intentions because God does. And we
Yep.
should probably care about what God cares about. And I
Yep.
believe God will judge me by my intentions. Now, I will also be judged for what I do and how my intentions lead to wrong action. But I'm not concerned about the state of my soul.
Yep.
Um, so therefore, I think I have a certain freedom to be concerned about my neighbor and the neighborhood in which they live, because that matters too.
Yeah.
So I think there's something about a focus on piety versus a focus on shalom that is at play here, and that matters.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
But you'd
I
still
don't
want
know.
to say to some extent that, um, and I know you would say this, but I think I can just hear the rejoinder coming back that um, moral rules matter, morals matter, doing
Yep,
right matters. We ought not do evil things to bring about good consequences. That's a
correct.
sort of ends means way of thinking
Yep,
about ethics. And I know that that's not what you mean,
right,
um, but I know I can just already hear the and I think part of this a clarification that's happened throughout this discussion over the weeks in reading is the question of consequences is really a live question. I think you're going to find certain Christians, Catholics in particular, are going to um, really have and this is a longer conversation as to why, the nature of consequentialism and debates within Catholic moral
right,
theology, which have been going on for some decades now. Um, but they've always had, let's say, a more ambivalent relationship with consequences, at least as they pertain to morally right action, right? So what the right thing to do, Catholics are going to, um, at least, the default position is going to focus more on virtues and moral rules and not on consequences, where I think you and I, with a stronger Christian realist disposition, are going to say, I think this fits in well with your point on shalom, which is we're going to say, how do we move this from A to B being a better state of affairs,
right.
even if marginally so. And that's going to have to be, we want to do it in a moral fashion, but part of that moral calculus is going to be that end state that we're aiming for. And so I think probably for future conversation is going to be, how do we envision that happening in a way that maybe our Catholic friends would find more resonant, and wouldn't lapse into wouldn't fall into the traps that they are very cautious about.
That's right. And what you can do for me at some point is to work out for me how it is that somebody like Paul Ramsey, who we'll be talking about in the future,
Yeah.
how Paul Ramsey, despite our bringing him to bear on in our defense,
Yeah.
giving us, a way of thinking about morality. How he can nevertheless be called a deontologist, right?
Right.
He was his own kind of absolutist,
Yes.
as am I. There are some things you never do. You never boil the baby, right? You just don't.
Yes.
So
Yes.
Anscombe,
Yeah.
we're good. Don't boil the
Yeah.
baby.
Yeah. Right.
We just don't want the baby thrown out with the bathwater as well, right? We want to sort of do both. So
Yep.
absolutists, but there's a different line. And Paul Ramsey, I think you've been doing a lot of good work on his important essay, The Case of the Curious Exception, and you're going to help flesh all that out for us, because Ramsey, however poetic he is a little opaque.
Yes. Ramsey's got this great line. He called it the knobbly hide of reality.
Yes,
And I think
I
for you and I,
underlined.
we love that. That line could be right above my desk, which is
Yep,
reality is knobbly.
it's knobbly.
And
Yes,
when you brush up against it, I mean, moral rules are valuable, but what he was an expert at, in which I think the spirit that you and I both admire, is his willingness to really take that reality seriously
yep.
and to wrestle with it. So hopefully we'll continue wrestling. But with that, we are going to end. The time is nigh. But thank you once again, Mark, for a great conversation.
No, thank you. This is great. I hope
Yep.
it's helpful to other people. It's good for me.
Yes, it's good for me, and we'll continue working this out in future events. So until then, adieu.
Take care.
Take care.